Hey, welcome back. This is Clay, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on the Great Reset. We'll look more today at really the ideas and the consequences. What has the Great Reset actually done? What impact has it actually had? We can look at a specific example and see kind of what we can glean about the future to come. Now, last time we left off with an Ayn Rand quote about men who produce nothing. Well, today we'll start off with another quote from Henry Kissinger. Now, why Henry Kissinger? Well, Henry Kissinger was actually Klaus Schwab's professor and mentor. Schwab looks up to him and admires much of what he did and said. Well, what did Kissinger say? What's the pertinent quote here? Kissinger once said that if you control the food, you control the people. If you control the energy, you control the country. If you control the money, you control the world. So, how does this fit in? Well, for the past 2 decades, the rate of global food production has increased faster than population growth. You heard me correctly. We produced our growth in food production has exceeded the growth in population. Well, starting about 2009 through 2019, we actually produced enough food to feed the whole world. First time in history that we know of. Now, we didn't have the logistics to get it everywhere, so there's still some issues there, but we have the ability now to feed everyone. In fact, the 2019 food production was enough to feed about 10 billion people, the estimated population of the world in 2050. So to me, that's quite an accomplishment. Now, the key is the last couple of years, starting in 2020, with COVID and other policies we'll talk about shortly, food production has declined. So far as continuing to decline. There is now a food scarcity around the world, according to the USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, and the UN. In in 21 and 22, we saw rapid increases in food prices brought on by supply disruptions, pandemic, embargoes, and government regulations. Even war resulted in lower food and higher energy cost. Now, there's one underlying principle here. You can't have mass food production without cheap energy. It's that simple. Farmers need, if they're going to mass produce, they need equipment for their tractors, harvesters, all the equipment they use. They need fuel to be able to get it to market, to transport it. And if energy is not available, if it's more expensive, that obviously throws a wrench in the works for food production. Well, the USDA study that I referenced a minute ago identified the number of what they called food insecure people in 2022 is estimated at about 1.3 billion people. 1.3 billion people. That's an increase of about 119 million people in just 1 year, or a 10% increase. The study also showed that most every region in the world is producing less food. Per UN estimates, it's possible that over the next 2 years, nearly 860 million people will starve to death. Next 2 years, 860 million people. Now, while that estimate is hopefully high, it does draw attention to the crisis. And yes, there is a crisis going on now, a food scarcity crisis. Now, it hadn't been covered much in the media. We've seen here in the US, we've seen prices soar, but we haven't really had terrible shortages of food since early, what was it, 22? There was, some empty shelves. Now, when I go to the store, I notice that there are fewer choices, that the inventory levels are lower than they used to be, but I really don't have any problem buying food. And I don't think most people have any problem with the availability of food, though the steep increase in prices have hurt a number of people. The poor, the middle class have had to change the way they eat because they can't afford to eat the way they used to. So the inflation really takes a toll on the poor and the middle class. Now, what's happened? Why is there the food shortages? Well, some of it's due to droughts. Some of it's due to pests. A lot of it is due to regulations, government policy, in other words. Now, particularly those policies which impact the small farmers and their ability to survive, their ability to produce, their ability to make money, to profit. You don't stay in business long if you don't make a profit. Now, these issues range from estate taxes to food certification policies to increased taxes on energy. So these things are expensive for the small farmer, but relatively cheap to the industrial farmers. Now, estate taxes. Some of you are probably going, how do estate taxes impact small farmers? Well, you've got a family farm, 10,000 acres, whatever, that is, passed down through the years from generation to generation. And during that time, a city that was a couple hours away has grown and sprawled, and just land values in general have appreciated. So when the last generation of family inherits the farm, they inherit a significant asset or value in the eyes of the IRS, and they owe taxes. Well, the families have all this land, but they don't have cash. They can't just cough up $100,000, $200,000 for taxes, for estate taxes. So they have to sell it. They may sell it to a corporate farmer, they may sell it to a land developer, whatever, but they're out of the family farming business. So that's taken a toll on the small family farms. A lot of the regulations requiring certification of the health and state and all of the farms. I saw a health inspector visiting an Amish farm trying to shut them down because they didn't meet all the newfangled health regulations. It was kind of ridiculous. But for a large industrial farm, they can meet these kind of regulations. For an individual farmer, it's just kind of like nickel and diming them to death, or the cost is prohibitively expensive considering what they're able to produce. So these are issues that have impacted production. There are other government issues that have impacted production, and these are more pertinent to our discussion on the Great Reset. If we take a look at one country that has perfectly implemented the Great Reset's ideas, structures, policies, Sri Lanka. What has happened in Sri Lanka? You'll note that, for example, Sri Lanka has one of the highest ESG scores in the world. Remember, ESG was the non-economic standard to measure performance of companies and now nations. ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. Well, Sri Lanka's president was elected in 2015 or 16, and he ran on a platform of making Sri Lanka a shining example to the world in regard to ESG policies, what he referred to and what's commonly known as sustainable policies, ESG compliance. How did ESG rank? Well, if we look here on the World Economics page, you can see Sri Lanka has a score of 99.6 out of 100. That's one of the highest in the world. And I mean, in terms of production, they're in good company. You've got Laos, Nicaragua, Georgia, El Salvador, Lithuania, Lebanon, Haiti, Costa Rica, Sierra Leone, all these great industrial production, agricultural production areas. So it seems like from the survey, just on the surface, the best way to get a high score is don't produce anything. That might be a clue there. Sri Lanka's score of 99.6 is higher than the US, Canada, Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany. So, what does this mean for the people of Sri Lanka? Let's take a look. Its impact on agriculture, the primary export, primary industry of the nation, is very clear. The government, shortly after being elected, banned the use of fertilizers because they want to prevent pollution. They banned the use of pesticides because they want to ban the risk of pollution. They didn't want farmers using fungicides, no pollution. They didn't want the farmers doing anything that could be perceived as hurting the environment. However, you prioritize different things in the environment, whether it's bugs or fungus or whatever. Taxes on fuel soared as well because the government wanted farmers to limit their use to reduce pollution. Now, what was the result of these ideas? Absolutely devastated production, killed production. In the first year of implementation, rice production fell 20%. Prices on rice increased by 50%. It was so bad that Sri Lanka, for the first time in decades, had to import rice, $450 million of rice, to try to prevent mass starvation. When in previous years, Sri Lanka was a large exporter of rice and tea. It was more than self-sufficient. Individual farmers were reporting drops anywhere up to 50% in production of rice or tea. Rice mills shut down because there was no rice to grind. So unemployment started soaring. Bottom line, food prices soared, jobs were lost. Now, the increasing debt, the expenses from importing rice, the crashing income in Sri Lanka forced it to default on its debt payments to other nations. The entire economy of the nation was thrown into chaos. Inflation hits 30%. Sri Lanka went to the World Bank and asked for a loan to help them buy food and medicines. The World Bank refused because their economic condition was so bad. The World Bank refused to lend to them. Now, for good or bad, the World Bank doesn't have a great history as a charitable organization. Sri Lanka elected a president that vowed to halt the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, which had propelled Sri Lanka's economy forward, increased growth greatly, started building a middle class. Expanding economies tend to do that a whole lot better than collapsing economies. There was an attendant rise in living standards for everybody in Sri Lanka. The plans that the president implemented worked just as expected if you studied history and had any basic notion of economics. By the summer of 2022, Sri Lankans were starving, or as the FDA describes it, they were food insecure. They had no fuel. Crop production was down 60% this past year. The nation of Sri Lanka is just absolutely in shambles. So there you have it, a country that implemented the plan and achieved the goal by design. Now, wait a minute, you're probably going, wait, you say this was by design? This collapse and failure was by design? Tell me I'm wrong. What outcome Do you honestly expect, if you farm, if you're a farmer, if you're growing crops, I don't care if you're growing them in the backyard or for sale, and you can't fertilize your crops, you can't use pesticides, you can't use fungicides to protect your plants and your crops, and you can't afford or don't have access to any fuel to take them to the market or to harvest them. Seriously, what do you think the outcome of those policies will be? And let's be honest, bottom line, there is nothing more toxic to humans than a lack of food. The leaders of Sri Lanka, the leaders of the Great Reset, are smart people, well educated. They understand agriculture, they understand history and the like. But they, by their own words, by their own ideas, they have an undying belief that the world is overpopulated and too rich. You doubt me? For example, the UN had an article up for years on its webpage stating that starving people was a good thing because there are jobs going unfulfilled in the world and otherwise would go unfulfilled if there weren't poor and starving people. It received attention, and this last summer, summer of 22, the UN pulled it off its website. And they tried calling it satire, kind of like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, 150, 200 years ago. But funny, the UN doesn't publish satire. It doesn't put it on its website. And the author of the article itself points out clearly it was not satire. And the author stood by every word and has stated that the UN knew what they were posting. Remember Kissinger's comment about the food, about control the food, you control the people? Well, if people have an abundance of food or too much food, they're a whole lot less likely probably to listen to authorities. If they're starving and desperate and depending on government to provide them food, they're probably a whole lot more likely to do what government wants and says. Now, this all stems from an economic construct which underlies the Great Reset, the overpopulation of the world kind of thing. This idea in economic theory is referred to as Malthusian economics, been around for 200 years. This was strongly advocated in a book by Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich is kind of a guru to many in the Great Reset political realm. His book was titled Ecoscience, Population, Resources. He argued that the world couldn't support everyone. His solution? He argued against modern farming techniques, the very ones that led to, a few years ago, producing enough food for everybody in the world to eat, something that Ehrlich held was impossible. Well, again, we don't have the logistics to get it to everyone, but we can produce the food. Ehrlich stated, and the contention is held among many in the Great Reset, that we should go back to utilization of more human labor, less mechanization, less dependence on fertilizers, less dependence on insecticides, less dependence on machinery in general. This has come to be known as sustainable farming, or sometimes organic farming. Now, Ehrlich argued there should be more redistribution and less availability to the masses. Now, please understand, I am not arguing against organic farming. My daughter would kill me. She absolutely loves Whole Foods, organic farming, whatever. And they can buy it. Some people can afford it and can buy it. But my point is in terms of mass food production, organic farming takes more land. It produces a lower yield. You can't have individuals running large farms without machinery. You can't get the labor to where you need it in times when you need it to harvest the crops. The facts are simple. More land will be needed to farm, output will drop, and people will be hungry. They will go hungry or they will starve, much like what we saw in Sri Lanka. We've seen the laboratory. We don't really have to doubt the results. Now, you know, Ehrlich and, even Malthus, they both, I think, loved the poor, cared about the poor. They loved them so much that they wanted to implement policies that produce more of them. The unstated goal is to let some die from starvation, from pandemics, whatever. They hold it's necessary for the survival of the planet. It's a form of triage. The most valuable thrive, the useful survive, and the needless die. Who do you think the most valuable is? Well, that obviously would be the leaders of the Great Reset. I mean, they were in Davos, flying there in their private jets, eating food that costs more than most people make in a year, wearing their designer clothes or Patagonia or whatever, trying to decide ways that the common people could do with less. Remember, that's one of the goals we saw last time in the little 2-minute video. Everybody will have to sacrifice. They don't even want you leaving your home. You'll own nothing. No cars. You won't own your house or your residence. Everything will be delivered to you via a drone, so they don't even really want a whole lot of personal contact. I just find this all fascinating. Now, farmers in this country are paid not to grow food, at least on part of their land oftentimes. Well, with the food shortages and the soaring prices, a group of farmers went to our Secretary of Agriculture and asked him for permission to farm this land, even offered to give the money back or pay back out of their sales. And he said no, because it would violate the terms that we had signed in the Paris Accords. Think about that. Can you imagine your government signing a treaty saying we will not produce more food, even if inflation's soaring, even if there's starvation? We will not produce more food because we don't want to create pollution. Here we see the transformational power of the Great Reset in action. Sri Lanka did it. They achieved the goal, implemented the policies, achieved the goal, saw the results. Imagine if they couldn't import rice, medicine, energy. Wouldn't that be better? Oh, wait, they actually couldn't. What if other nations followed suit in order to protect the earth? Some are. Some actually are. A lot of Western countries are slowly implementing policies and changes to make energy more expensive and food more expensive. Our administration has, in the last couple of years, implemented at least 80 different policies or regs to reduce or hinder energy production in this country. We see less fertilizer being used, less energy being produced. The U.S. has completely halted exploration of new oil, gas, new energy sources, and is constantly encouraging everybody to go green, talking about the damage carbon fuels might do to the planet. Now, what we don't see is these people pointing out how we'll run out of rare earth materials used to manufacture the engines and windmills, or lithium used to manufacture batteries, way before we would ever run out of oil. They don't talk about how cheap and available energy is necessary for prosperity. Where there's no energy, there is no economic growth. There is lower economic production. Again, everybody needs to sacrifice. That's one of the Great Reset's stated values. They are not quiet about it. They care more about sustainability than economic growth. Their own words, not mine. They want people to be more concerned about sustainability than productivity. Also note the increased pressure to move to electric, all electric conveniences. Why? Just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, our government put out a study showing that or indicating that natural gas stoves could be harmful and encouraging people to switch to electric stoves and encouraging or threatening banning natural gas stoves, natural gas fireplaces, all of these, natural gas heating. So we also possibly are moving our currency to electric before long. The Federal Reserve is on target to implement a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, a crypto coin of its own. That's kind of the cool thing about electricity, and is that the government always knows what you're doing, how much you're using. If it was money, a cryptocurrency, they'd know where it was being spent, how much was spent, how much you were, receiving, all of that. What it ultimately does is gives them control and the ability to cut it off. Remember the truck drivers in Canada? There was a GoFundMe started to help fund them while they were protesting, and the GoFundMe was shut off. People even had their bank accounts frozen. What are you going to do if you can't access your money in your bank account for months? Interesting question. And, is this possible? Well, let's look at the WEF, the World Economic Forum's own description of benefits. Here's the first one taken out of, one of their own brochures. Our world is transforming. Big community trends for sustainable cities. My favorite word, sustainable cities. We've got an idea of what sustainable does in agriculture. Wonder what it'll do in cities. Well, they talk about different things. And the first one here is kind of fascinating to me. COVID-19 was the test of social responsibility. Test of social responsibility. That's just fascinating phrasing right there. But they go on. A huge number of unimaginable restrictions. Their words again, not mine. Unimaginable restrictions for public health were adopted by billions of citizens across the world. They're getting kind of giddy about this. Can you tell? There were numerous examples globally of maintaining social distancing, wearing masks, mass vaccinations, and acceptance of contact tracing applications for public health, which demonstrated the core of individual social responsibility. Remember, we talked about how the Great Reset wants to transform values and opinions, get people's minds off productivity and prosperity and get it on sustainability. That's exactly what they're saying there. We ran the test. We can control the people. We can make them compliant. They can stay in their houses. They will do what they are told. Now, am I still exaggerating? What's next? Sustainable cities enabled through smart communities. What's a smart community? Well, I imagine it's not much different than smart devices like Alexa or your phone or your computer, who listen in to most everything you do and can, in many cases, actually tell you what's available and what's not, or make suggestions in your own best interest. That's smart, having a phone tell you what you should and shouldn't do. Okay, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but I have a hard time with most anybody telling me what to do, much less an inanimate device. But they talk about 3 trends provide strong evidence toward enabling a social movement for my carbon initiatives, enabling public-private partnerships to help curate this program. Public-private partnerships. Remember, we talked about how the Great Reset didn't care much for small businesses, but was interested in forming a government and large corporation partnership to govern various domains. Large corporations, there would be very few of them, a few handpicked, basically creating worldwide monopolies. That's their stated goal. Now, Suggested to drive a three-way approach. First of all, you want to drive economic behavior. How do you drive economic behavior? Well, you increase cost for carbon intensive activities and goods. So you increase costs for production. You increase costs for acquiring goods and services. How do you increase cost? You make them less available or taxes. That's the way. Secondly, economic incentives to reduce demand and improve efficiency. What's an economic incentive for you to buy less? Higher prices, inflation, soaring. You've got same demand but less production, or you've got taxes again. Economic incentives to reduce demand. Second driver, cognitive awareness, raised visibility of personal carbon footprints. Again, pushing sustainability as the key concept over productivity. I refer to this as the guilt approach. You make people feel guilty for eating and living and taking care of their family so that they'll do less of it. They want raised awareness of personal carbon limits. They're going to put personal carbon limits on what you can or can't do. This will sustain the transition to a net zero carbon society. Interesting. The third driver, social norms. New definition of a fair share of personal emissions. What you want to bet it's going to be a whole lot less than what you use to heat your car and drive to work now. Setting of acceptable levels of personal emissions. Again, everything is about reducing and controlling what the individual does and how they do it. That's the Great Reset. It's a whole different paradigm, a whole different worldview of what you do and how you do it. Now, the stated goal is to save the earth, which is a heartwarming goal to be sure. But in their execution of the goal, people become a whole lot less important. Now, I'm not arguing we shouldn't care about the world or the air, the earth, the area we live in, how we utilize resources. We should be responsible. Where we can, we should use less. I have no problem with that. I think simpler ultimately is better. I think we do have, some excesses in this country and others. But the key is I decide that. I decide for me and my family what's best. Each individual decides for them, their family, their kids, their children, what is best. I just haven't seen in history where a bureaucrat does better at allocating resources and telling you what you can and can't do, the decisions being taken away from you and being made by a bureaucrat. I've just never seen that work out for the betterment of the people or the world. So, this is why the traditional view of man, particularly in the Western world, each individual being of infinite worth, having inalienable rights, must be done away with, and a new transformational view of man installed. In this country, we were, the one thing that makes the U.S. different from the rest of the world is we're founded on the premise that each and every person has in God-given inalienable rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, and most uniquely, the right to pursue their own happiness. This stands in stark contrast to the goals of the Great Reset. People must become disposable cogs in the system. The value of the individual must become nothing. The value of the collective is everything. The Great Reset. Now, that's a kind of a summary of the actual, what has the Great Reset done? In part 3, we'll take a look at, what to expect going forward, maybe how to plan going forward, what to plan for. I hope this was of some interest. Whether you agree with it completely or not, let me know. If you've got questions, let me know. You can ask in the comments, or you can DM me privately on Twitter, Moffett on Money. I appreciate you watching. My time is up. I thank you for yours.